Hey guys, welcome to the fifth and final part of my blind solving tutorial. This part isn't really formally part of the tutorial itself, but I think it's just as important as any of the other parts. So this part is directed at the people who are comfortable blind solving using M2 and Old Pachman, who are comfortable with memorization and can get consistent successes. If you're not quite there yet, you can still watch this video, you can still learn from it, but the techniques that I'm going to be teaching in this video are not going to be as useful as just reviewing the techniques that you learned in the previous videos. So this video is about how to get sub 2. The journey to sub 2 can be very difficult for some people, but I'm convinced that if you know the correct, goals that you should set for yourself, sub 2 is very achievable for anyone. Once you're sub 2, things are really a lot easier because you can memorize fast and solve fast, and your solves take a lot less time. And I personally spent 3 months getting sub 2, and then I spent about 3 weeks getting from sub 2 to sub 130. So here we go. I'm just going to be giving a few pieces of advice about blind solving, but they are sort of very, very, very important things. So the first thing, which I've mentioned in previous videos, is just to get everything as automatic as possible. Most people start out with where executing a target involves recalling what letter the target is, and then thinking about where that sticker is on the cube, and then thinking about what their setup move might be, and then doing the setup move, and then thinking about undoing the setup move, and then repeat that process. And that's okay when you're starting out, but obviously later that becomes too inefficient. And the thing about blind solving is that the slower your memo is, the slower your execution is, and the slower your execution is, the slower your memo is. So just improving one thing about your solve can cause a chain reaction and improve many other things. For example, right after my first sub 2 solve, my friend said to me, it doesn't seem like you turn very fast during your solves. I said, no, it doesn't. So I decided I would try to turn faster during my solves. And since I turned faster, my execution was faster. And since my execution was faster, my memo could be faster because I didn't need to remember it as long. And so things like that just perpetuate themselves. So, yes, so being as automatic as possible with your targets is extremely important. For your Old Pachman corners, you need to think, as soon as you think like J, for example, or whatever letter you have for any position, it shouldn't be, okay, where's J? Okay, what's my setup move? It needs to at first be, okay, I know my setup. It needs to at first be, J is right here, I know my setup move for J. And then later it needs to be J. Okay, it's this. And then while you're doing that, you can be thinking about the next target. So while in speed solving, you need to do look ahead. In blind solving, you need to do think ahead. Fortunately, Old Pachman corners, there are only so many targets. You can get these targets to be very automatic very quickly. Once they're automatic for you, you can start using think ahead. You can, instead of thinking, okay, J, setup move, right, execute, algorithm, undo setup move, you can be thinking J, okay, it's this. Okay, what's my next target? My next target is L. Okay, I know my setup move for L, and there you go. Then you're doing your next target, and so on. So that kind of thing is extremely important, and that will bring down your execution, which in turn will bring down your memorization, and everything will become a lot easier once things become more and more automatic. Of course, you should search for things being more automatic during memorization as well. Finding your words, at a certain point should not be a challenge. If it is a challenge for you, you should consider making yourself a letter pair list of all your words. there's going to be a certain point where you've seen every word. For me, when I reached that point where I'd seen every word multiple times, I had a sort of a fixed list that I was using, even though I had never explicitly written down the words. In any aspect of speed cubing, it's very important to be able to always be identifying your problems. I think that in blind solving, it's particularly easy because while you're doing a blind solve, when you have something that takes you longer than it should, it's really obvious. Like if you are someone in particular who has trouble finding a new piece to break into a new cycle for, that's something you can identify because it takes you a long time to do that. And that's something you can fix fairly easily just by, practicing memorization and practicing different ways of finding those pieces. And if one of your problems is that you have a certain letter pair that you have trouble remembering, you maybe need to change that letter pair or just reinforce it by thinking about it more, or imagining something that's more vivid. And so I really advise you guys to, while you're practicing, if you're doing a session of like 5 solves, for example, don't just go one solve to the next. Do a solve and then think to yourself, what did I stumble over during that solve? Was it a perfect solve? And if it was a perfect solve, then maybe you've got to be thinking to yourself, I need to push my memorization. And so that's the next step. Once you're at the point where your solve is at that level perfect, where you're memorizing and then executing with no pauses, you need to start pushing your memorization. And what that means is you just decide, I'm going to memorize faster. That's all that pushing memorization is. When you do solves where you push memorization, you don't worry about how fast your execution is. You just say, I'm going to memorize this fast at a slightly faster pace or rhythm than usual, and then you execute your targets. And maybe recall takes you a little bit longer because you memorized a little more quickly, but that's okay because you're training your memorization and not your execution. And then on the other hand, you can push your execution. You can try to memorize more slowly and then execute with no pauses at all. And if you've never had a solve where your execution had no pauses at all, I can tell you that it feels amazing. So it might be a good idea to do some solves where you try to, just to get the feel of execution with no pauses, just do a solve where you memorize slow enough that you can recall perfectly. Memorization might take you 3 times as long as usual, but that's the kind of thing you want to be shooting for. Then, your goal with practicing can become to combine those two things to get the solves where the memorization is as fast as possible and the execution is as fast as possible. And then you're going to want to try and make that sort of fastest possible speed become your new normal speed, and then continue to push your memo, push your execution, and bring things down. So yeah, just get all your targets completely automatic, especially during M2. If you're using audio edges and you can blast through your edge memo just by doing target after target after target, that's going to be a huge advantage because there are a lot of edges, and if you're and you have this audio string of edge memo in your head, if you have to think about every target, that's going to slow you down a ton. So try to get your M2 targets really automatic, especially if you're using audio edges, because then when you can just execute target after target without thinking about it just from that audio string, you'll get to your corners really quickly. And then you won't need to remember your corners for as long, and so on. So yeah, so far, just get your targets and your memorization as automatic as possible, and then sort of try to push things down, try to force yourself to be faster than you think you can be. But there's really the first thing is to try and make things automatic. when you have a 10-second pause during a solve, ask yourself why that happened and try to make it so that that kind of thing doesn't happen again. And that's, and those are really the techniques that I used to get faster. Just isolate problems and then fix them. You might have to, if your edge execution is too slow, maybe do some solves where you just execute edges. Be creative with your problem solving. Blind solving might be all about being automatic, but you can really find good ways to practice that aren't just, sitting there doing solves. Because a lot of people, they learn how to blind solve, they get to about 4 minutes, and then they say, what now? The answer to that question is, and then they say, well, okay, I can't learn 3 styles, or BH, so what do I do? The answer is to push yourself and to identify your problems, and put in deliberative practice and not just doing solves. And so, yeah, if you have a question about a problem that you have and you want to know how you can fix it, ask me. I'm here to help you. But yeah. So the other thing that you can do, and this is for more advanced people, I wouldn't recommend adding this in until you're at least close to sub 2, is doing something called advanced M2. And so all advanced, I basically would put 2 techniques into advanced M2. The first is doing setup moves before your cycles, and so I'll talk about that first. So to do a setup move, so times when you want to do a setup move before a cycle, in particular are the times when you have the cycles that involve the horrible pieces. And the horrible pieces are FU, BU, and BD. And that's because your algs for those are just much longer than all the rest. The rest are either 1, 4, 7, or 1, 4, 7, or 9 moves. 1 for UB, 4 for these two, 7 for most other things, and 9 for this target and this target, UR and UL. However, you then have these other targets which just kind of suck, because this one is 11 moves if you do it the way I taught you, and this one is 13 moves, and this one's also 11 moves. So what can we do about that? Well, what we can do is we can just do a move before the cycle to make sure that that target doesn't happen. So let's say my cycle, let's say my whole edge memo is IJ, or if you're not using my letter scheme, FU, FR. So I wanna go ahead and execute this cycle. So now we're thinking in cycles. You don't really have to know what a 3 cycle is to understand this. When I say a cycle, I'm talking about 2 consecutive targets. And the reason why it's important to talk about 2 consecutive targets is because between 2 consecutive targets, the M slice is off by 2. And so it's doing 2 targets that results in the M slice being fixed again. So let's say I don't want to do the ugly algorithm that you need to execute this target. Well, what I can do is I can just do the move U prime, for example. And now this original target piece is right here, and so it's at RU instead of FU. So now my cycle, instead of being FU FR, is RU FR. And so I need to execute those 2 targets. Now this is very important. You need to do your setup move, then execute both targets, and then undo the setup move. And it's as simple as that. You can do this for all sorts of targets. You can, like for example, one cycle where it's really useful is here. Here I have BU and then UL, or QD. So here, not only can I move the Q piece move my first target out of the bad place where I have to do the 13 move target, with a U, I'm also moving this piece from here into UB. So so then I have my cycle, or my two consecutive targets, which I would memorize as one word or image in my head, has moved from being BU to UL, which is one of the nastiest cycles you can have, to being RU to UB, which is one of the nicest. In fact, it's just 8 moves long, or 10 moves if you count the setup moves. And so, yeah, so that cycle involves both of the two situations where I would recommend doing a setup move before your cycle and then undoing it after your cycle. The first situation, which I already went over, is the one where you have, these bad targets that take lots of moves. Just do a setup move for this one, for example, or if it's this one, you might do a B to move it over here instead, and then execute it as T or BR, and then a B prime after the cycle, stuff like that. And the other situation is when you just want to create a cycle that has the UB target. The UB target is by far the nicest target. So, for example, if you have this target ever, if you ever have UL or UR, you can always do a U or a U prime respectively to create UB as a target in a cycle. So here I have, so like if I have, FL UL, I can do a U to make it FL UB. And so now I've changed this 9 move target into a 1 move target. Yay! And so that can be extremely helpful. So, play around with that kind of thing. These ideas are sort of even more closely related to techniques you might use in 3-style than even just M2. And so, yeah, don't be intimidated by this. It's just before you execute, one of your pairs of letters, just do a setup move and then undo it. Of course, it doesn't work if you're just doing like your final odd letter in a parity solve, because you don't have 2 to execute. So that's very important. Just make sure it's 2 in a row. It could be your first letter pair, your second, doesn't matter which one. Just do the setup move, then execute your 2 targets, then undo the setup move. And the other technique I would put into advanced M2 is just cancellations during setup moves. This happens whenever you have 2 consecutive targets. Again, they should form a pair. I'm not talking about the, it could work for the second letter of one pair and the first letter of the next pair, but you're less likely to see it for those situations. But anyway, so this happens when you have 2 targets in a row that take place on the same inside or outside of the same face. So if you have 2 targets in a row on the outside of the right face, it might work. If you have 2 targets in a row on the inside of the right face, 2 targets in a row on the inside of the left face, or 2 targets in a row on the outside of the left face, then this will work. One thing to note, though, is that you don't want it to include the special 4-move setup targets, being this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, because those are different. But what we can do, for example, is, let's say our cycle is let's say our cycle, and by cycle I just mean letter pair, is DR FR, or VJ. What we can do is our first setup move is UR to U prime, M2, right? And then to undo that setup move, we have to do UR to U prime. However, we might also notice that our setup move after that is going to be UR U prime for the next target. So instead of doing UR to U prime, UR U prime, we're just going to do UR prime U prime, then M2, and then undo the J setup move, UR prime U prime. So that's the kind of thing you can play around with. You can end up with the same thing. For example, if we have LULF, that's going to be an inside example. Then here, I'll just set that up. let's see, we've got, yes, LULF, right? We do the first setup move, M2, and then instead of doing BLB prime, BL2B prime, we just do BL prime, B prime to put the next one into place, M2, BL2, B prime. So those are some more advanced techniques for M2. Really only even think about using those techniques if your M2 is already automatic, if you're already sort of blasting through your edges where your only pauses are from memo and not from execution. And so that's really all I have to say about getting yourself down into the sub 2 range. Once you're sub 2, if you're very consistent, I predict that you'll get down to around times of 130 pretty quickly. And then once you're at 130 and you don't think you can get any faster just by, improving your memo and execution, that's when it'll be time to learn 3-style. And I have a 3-style tutorial on my channel if you're that fast. And I also have a tutorial on memorization. I did sort of avoid the some of the specifics of getting your memorization faster in this video because I have this other video. You can find the link in the description, and as always, ask me your questions. So thanks for watching my tutorial. I hope you learned a lot about blind solving, and I'll see you in season 3.